Welcome, everyone. This is Addy Ads, Anakin Skywalker, YouTube's chosen one. I have a very special guest here with me today, author James Perloff. Mr. Perloff has been writing books for over 35 years now, including titles like Truth is a Lonely Warrior, The Shadows of Power, Tornado in a Junkyard, and The Case Against Darwin. I just started Truth is a Lonely Warrior today, and it has 5-star reviews on Amazon. Mr. Perloff started writing, as I said, over 35 years ago, and he has quite the following on Twitter as well. I'll be sure to put all his links in the description box below. But Mr. Perloff, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I really appreciate you taking time out of your schedule.
Oh, well, thank you, Addy. It's nice to be on with you for the first time.
Definitely. Well, let's just start at the beginning. I actually found you via Charlie Robinson's podcast. So I watched that a couple times for research, in addition to going through your website as well. But just focusing on the writing, what was the what started that? What was the kind of genesis of what motivated you to start writing? Because that was not your what you first started out doing, correct?
Well, actually, I was an English major in college, and but I didn't foresee a future, immediate future for me as a writer. I'd written a couple of novels in high school, and actually had gotten down, been invited to Putnam's publisher, who liked my work, but it wasn't ready for, wasn't reader ready, and in Colby College up in Maine, where I was attending. I just didn't see a big future for me in English, even though I was an English major there. I didn't want to teach English, and I wasn't a good enough writer yet. And the brother of the professor was my dorm head, came in. He was a male registered nurse, and it turned out that, ironically, whereas men were kind of being discriminated against in a lot of fields, there was a big demand for men in nursing. He was a male registered nurse, this brother of the professor, and I had done volunteer work where in high school, where I saw registered nurses working, and I thought, this could be for me. So I wound up at the Boston University School of Nursing, which no longer exists, but I graduated from there in 1975. Meantime, I had a great interest in writing, so I was particularly interested in writing on the New World Order, which I discovered in 1978, reading Gary Allen's book, None Dare Call a Conspiracy. I found that sort of the anti-conspiracy headquarters at that time was the headquarters of the John Birch Society, which had their headquarters conveniently enough in Belmont, Massachusetts, not far from where I lived. So I went over there and I became a member of the society. And after a few years, I submitted one manuscript, which I didn't like, but then somebody introduced me to the new editor, Gary Benoit, in 1985 of the New American Magazine, which had just replaced their older journals. And my writing was successful with them. And in 1988, they asked me to write an article on the Council on Foreign Relations, which became so big that it would have overflowed the boundaries of the magazine. That wound up being a bestseller for them in book form, called The Shadows of Power. And later on, I wrote some books in the 90s on creation versus evolution. But after 9/11, I realized that geopolitics were really the most pressing issue to address. So I started my own blog, which is jamesperloff.com, and I have a couple of books on the New World Order, which I'll just mention. You mentioned one already, which Truth is a Lonely Warrior. It's a primer on the New World Order, and a supplementary book, 13 Pieces of the Jigsaw. Those are designed, when people are in the Matrix, it's very hard to get them out of it. And I find you just address one subject, it doesn't do the trick. You really need to show them who's been running America, how they've been running false flags, who controls the media. You have to give them the big picture in a documented but easy to read way to start lifting them out into the truth.
As far as the media, and actually, let's just back up a little bit. You actually, that book, Gary Allen's book, None Dare Call It a Conspiracy. You actually just saw some random person reading it, right? Or some random woman reading it.
It was a girl reading the book, and it's one of those moments for me, which doesn't happen very often, where something told me, you have to get that book. I didn't talk to the girl. I didn't ask what the book was about. I saw the cover and I said, something told me I have to get that book. So I went to a local bookstore on Beacon Street in Massachusetts, in Boston, and it just happened to have it on the shelf, and I read it, and it just changed my outlook on history forever. Because for the first time in my life, I realized that history was not a random unfolding of events, but there was an agenda driving it, and an agenda that had been concealed by the mainstream media. Because Gary Allen talked in there about the Fed, he talked about the Council of Foreign Relations, he talked about Lusitania. He didn't talk about everything to do with the New World Order, but it was enough in there that it really, I was now making sense of history. And I was very excited from that point on, and have been ever since.
And the Lusitania is the World War I ship accident. Is that correct?
Yeah, I did a talk last year at the Watertown Mass Public Library, a PowerPoint, which is on the welcome page of my website. It's called War and Deception. I actually go through the 1898 sinking of the Maine, the invasion of Mexico in 1914, which was done actually for the benefit of John D. Rockefeller's oil company, which is trying to take oil away from the Mexicans without properly compensating them. Then I go into the Lusitania, which is the false flag that brought us into World War I. I talk about Pearl Harbor and our foreknowledge of that, and our provocation of the attack, and the setting up of the fleet in Pearl Harbor. And then I go into the Korean War, which was a war for the benefit of authenticating the UN as a peacekeeper. It was a completely avoidable war. And then, of course, Vietnam with Tonkin Gulf. And then we get into the later wars, the 1991 Gulf War with the fake baby incubators. And then we go into 9/11 a little bit. And then we go into the modern wars, like the war in Iraq with the fake weapons of mass destruction. It seems there's hardly been a war we've been in recent century plus that wasn't brought on through some type of deception. So Lusitania was one of them.
The fake baby intubators, could you explain that? Because the WMD, I think everybody knows.
Oh, sure. In 1991, the public was reluctant to go along with the idea of invading in the Gulf in order to repel Iraq from Kuwait. Iraq actually went into Kuwait not as a matter of conquest, but because the Kuwaitis were slant drilling, they were stealing oil from Iraq, and they just wanted to get their oil back, basically. And April Glaspie, our ambassador, had told Saddam Hussein we would not interfere, and that's one reason why he went ahead. And April Glaspie said she's been silenced ever since. But because the public was not on board with this invasion yet, they had this girl come on, Nurse Nayera, maybe not remember the name quite correctly, but she went on and gave a tearful testimony before what looked to be a congressional committee. And she was saying that the Iraqi soldiers were throwing babies out of incubators on the floor and they were dying. She was crying. Well, it turned out that whole thing was a fake. She was not a nurse. She had not been in Kuwait at the time. She was a daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador, and that she'd been coached on how to give her testimony by Hilla Knowlton, which was a huge public relations firm. And it had not actually been an official congressional hearing. It was actually filmed at Hilla Knowlton. They did have some congressmen there to give it an official air, but it was a complete fakery. And George H.W. Bush, the president at that time, went along with it, and he talked about the incubator baby. So the public was convinced. Public opinion went in favor of invading at that point, but not until much later did people learn that testimony about the incubator babies was completely fake, total fabrication.
Okay, thanks.
They're all like that. They're all like that.
Yeah, it seems like it. I'm just starting to learn. Actually, it was Mr. Robinson who taught me what a false flag was. I may have been taught a while ago, but but probably not because of the U.S. educational system. Yeah, ever since then, I've been kind of re-looking at those events that they always set off the wars. Those like kind of one-offs. I'm just looking at them with a different lens. So just going back to the media, so you would say that since reading Gary Allen's book, that was what kind of triggered your distrust of the media? That was the inflection point, would you say?
Yeah, I don't know that I had complete distrust from that point on, but I knew that the history books I'd read had not taught me the correct version of history. I knew the way American public textbooks presented history was sort of a random unfolding of events. This country happened to invade that country, and we responded to defend freedom and democracy and that kind of thing. And it was all sort of random unfolding. But Allen's book showed that there was a definite agenda behind it. It was driving us in the direction of world government. He spoke about that he spoke about the UN and the League of Nations and the Council of Foreign Relations. how they were populating the cabinets of president after president and driving this agenda forward. And now history made sense. It was rational, unlike the mainstream media version.
And what is the Council on Foreign Relations, Mr. Perloff, for those who don't know?
Okay, so that is you could call it a think tank. It was set up in 1921, and it actually got its origin, its true roots at the 1919 Paris Peace Conference, which is settling the aftermath of World War I. And of course, Woodrow Wilson, the president of the United States, brought a 14-point plan. Then the 14th point was the League of Nations. Now, this is to be the first endeavor, first attempt to establish the beginnings of world government. And it was ratified at the Paris Peace Conference, but the Constitution specified for America to join in a treaty. This is called the Varascite Treaty that established the League of Nations. You had to have the consent of the U.S. Senate, which rejected it because they felt that the League could impose on our sovereignty. So that was a big disappointment for the banksters who were surrounding Woodrow Wilson in Paris at the time. And so they resolved, while it's still in Paris, to resolve new organizations that would advance the cause of world government. That included the Royal Institute of International Affairs in England, and in America, the Council on Foreign Relations, which was, they had all kinds of J.P. Morgan people in there. You know, they had John W. Davis, who was worked for J.P. Morgan and was J.P. Morgan's personal attorney as their first president, and their first chairman was Russell Leffingwell, who was on the board of chairman of the board, I believe.
And what was the name of
on the board of J.P. Morgan? I'm sorry.
What was the name of the English group that was
the Royal Institute of International Affairs?
Okay, so that's basically their counterpart. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, and they have other counterparts in other countries now as well.
Gotcha. Yeah, because some people don't know what that group is in depth, and it just comes up a lot in this kind of sphere of alternative media, I have noticed.
Sure,
but
it has been for a long time now. Yeah, since it was exposed.
Yeah, and so just moving up after college or university at Colby, what was the move then? Because you said you just started nursing, right?
Right. I actually transferred out of Colby College in 1972 to the Boston University School of Nursing. That school is now defunct. They closed it in 1988. But it was a bustling school when I was there. We had 600 students. It was a real going concern. And again, that was, I knew I needed a profession to support myself. I knew that I was not going to make it as a writer at that point. I wasn't mature enough to do that. So I was looking for a profession, and actually I've always liked nursing. I actually retired from it last year. I have been a nurse now for 45 years, but I liked, let me say it's often a hard grind in nursing. That's for sure. I had, plenty of bad days when I would come home exhausted. But one good thing about nursing, it balanced off my work as a writer, because in nursing you're on your feet, you're interacting with people all the time. And one of the pluses that came out of nursing for me was, you've really got to be well organized to be a nurse. I mean, to get through your day with all the tasks you have to get done, and it taught me how to be organized, and that's something that carries over into anything, including the writing.
That's quite interesting, and I know just from my own experience with having people in my family in the hospital that there are not very many male nurses. That's for sure. So they're definitely always looking for more. That I've noticed.
Yeah, it was 2% when I became a nurse. There were 2%. I don't know what the number would be now.
Oh wow, yeah, I don't know it either, but it's definitely a minority. But just a couple comments here, Mr. Perloff. Just somebody saying hi from Scotland.
Oh, nice.
And we also got Miss Venus Glow as well, and she is liking the interview as well, Mr. Perloff. Okay. So give me one second. This cat is asking to be let in. Okay. She would have just kept going forever.
Did you say Pat or cat?
A cat, yeah.
Well, I have a cat too, but I feed her very well before I go onto a podcast, so that she.
Yeah, it's actually not my cat, to be honest.
Okay.
But yeah, but we hang out now and again, so
Sure.
Pretty often actually. But yeah, so while you were nursing, you were actually writing. Moonlighting as a writer. So most of your writing career has actually been moonlighting. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, although there have been times when over the last 45 years when Actually, most of the time I was not a full-time nurse. I did have a number of years where I worked full-time, but if you work full-time as a nurse, you're probably going to be too exhausted to do any writing. So most of the time I was part-time. There even times when I took a hiatus, like when my mother had Alzheimer's, I didn't work as a nurse for a period of time. And by last year, the year I retired, I was down to just 1 day a week doing that to supplement my income.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah. And I know they have, or they usually have compressed schedules too. Did you guys have that?
What do you mean by compressed?
They'll do like, well, not all of them, but they'll have like 3 or 4 days where they work like long shifts.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then take
well, I try to spread it out. I didn't do that, but yeah, there are some nurses will get 40 hours in within, or 36 hours in within 3 days. They'll do 3 12-hour shifts and they get 4 days off. And so they work their butts off for 3 days, but then they get the 4 days off. So yeah, some people do that.
Yeah. And what is your process like for writing, and how has that changed over the years? Because I'm guessing your routine is not the same as when you started.
Well, yeah, when I started writing in the 80s, there was no internet and there were no word processors, as far as I know. So the very first book I wrote, the Shadows of Power, for me, one thing to do when you're writing a book or a major blog post is to first start by organizing your ideas. And word processors made that so easy. You can just move whole blocks of text around. But when I wrote that book, I actually put my ideas down on note cards and kept rearranging the note cards and having the right order. And then I actually wrote it in pencil, believe it or not, because pencil is easy to erase. I didn't like using carbon copies and things like that. But then once it was had it in pencil, then I started, and I was satisfied with it. Then I typed it up and submitted it to the publisher. But it's obviously much different now. It's beautiful now having the word processors. Makes you wonder how people wrote, back in the days of Thomas Jefferson when they didn't even have the typewriters. But now you can move text around. You can insert pictures on a website and do things so easily. So that's great. I do. There's a lot of things I don't like about the world today, but one thing I do like is that we have this technology that can assist us in so many ways.
Yeah, that's very interesting that you did it by hand first. No author that I've talked to yet has, or that even like, I think authors that I've listened to and just in other interviews, I don't think I've ever heard of one that that has done that. So that's quite interesting. And you grew up agnostic, as I understand, but you converted to Orthodox Christianity. Is that correct?
Yeah, actually, that's a very long process.
Yeah, do you want to go into that? Because I know there was, there's definitely a chapter in there with a group of people that I kind of skipped over, but we can start at the beginning too, if you'd like, Mr.
Well, yeah, I grew up in an agnostic home, basically no religion at all, no connection to God, which is not a healthy thing for me as far as I'm concerned. Then I was in a cult from 72 to 82, a very non-Christian cult, so sort of a New Age Gnostic type of thing. And when I started seeing deceptions within that, then I started. This is actually part of the effect of reading Gary Allen's None Dare Call a Conspiracy, was that that brought me over to the John Birch Society, and those people were almost uniformly Christians. And then I saw the Christians were actually the guys fighting against the New World Order, and that kind of was interesting. Because today we know the New World Order is Luciferian. If you've ever seen, you might not have seen it, but there's a really good series of interviews with a Dutch banker named Ronald Bernard came out over the last 2 to 3 years. And he was very high up in the banking world. And then they asked him to engage in child ritual sacrifice. And that's when he had to get out. You look deeply at this thing, when you Bohemian Grove, things like that, you start to realize that this thing is actually, these guys are Luciferians. There's no doubt about that. So the Christians are on the other end of it. Well, there's also non-Christians, to be sure, Muslims and New Agers as well, who, accounted who are, opposing this whole New World Order. But I became a Christian in the 80s. And I tended to settle into what they call the conservative evangelical churches. I didn't want to be part of the modernized churches, which the Rockefellers had infiltrated the mainline denominations with their great financial influence. I've got a chapter in my book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior, on that. Also a blog post called The War on Christianity Part 1, talking about how the Rockefellers supported seminaries that would water down the Christian faith. So I settled into what you would call sort of fundamental type Christian churches that believe the Bible and they were conservative, anti-abortion, and they were pro-traditional marriage, good values in them. But then I found out they'd been hijacked by the Rothschild Zionist movement, and they were totally pro-war and totally pro-Israel. I shouldn't speak in generalities, but there's some of the ones that I attended were like that. And also they started to warp their theology to go along with Christian Zionism that had been touted by the Scofield Reference Bible, where they say we got to support Israel and we got to support the rebuilding of the temple, which is really a temple for the Antichrist, not for Christ. But they think that Christ is going to rule from there in the long run. And so I found a lot of false theology, and I was kind of wondering where to settle, because I wanted to still be a worshiper of God. And then I listened to Brother Nathaniel. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's a Jewish convert to Orthodoxy, but he's a geopolitical commentator, great insights to what's going on in the world. He's a convert to Orthodoxy, and I didn't really pay that much attention. But then I was on a podcast with a guy named Dean Arnold, and I said, well, let me get to know the host a little bit. So I listened to an interview he did with Jay Dyer, and they're both converts to Eastern Orthodoxy, and that taught me a lot about it. I found that Eastern Orthodox, they still worship the way the original Christians did in the 4th century when Constantine actually legalized Christianity for the first time. And I was kind of excited about that because, I find that quite often you want to know how to do something right. You got to look back in time. Christianity, in a nutshell, there was a split between the East and West in 1054 AD. Up until then, it had basically been a uniform Christianity. And then from that point on, the split between the East and the West, Byzantium in the East, and you had the Vatican in the West. People in the West only saw Christianity through the Vatican. And over the years, the Vatican had some issues, of course. And then Martin Luther came along and he split off and formed the Protestant church. And all of a sudden, everybody's getting their own denomination going. And so if you go to a church in America today, chances are it's a spinoff of a spinoff of a spinoff of Martin Luther. And, I don't want to go to a spinoff. I need to find out what they. So there are a lot of things about the Orthodox Church that appealed to me. One was that they used a Septuagint version of the Old Testament, which is what Jesus used and the apostles used. And most of the other ones, other churches using the Masoretic version of the Old Testament, which is actually compiled 1,000 years after Christ. Plus the persecution of the Eastern Church, the attack on Byzantium by the Turks in 1453, and the murderous persecution of by the Bolsheviks of the church in Russia started in 1917, as well as the Ukrainian genocide. This is all aimed at the Eastern Orthodox. And I started looking more and more, and I started to see that they had a theology that was true to the way the apostles of Christ had laid it out. And I said, you know what, this is for me. So I did become Orthodox in the year. I'd been attending since 2016, but I actually became baptized into the church in 2017. So that's kind of my long version of my story, from agnostic to New Age to evangelical to Eastern Orthodox Christianity.
Thank you, Ms. Perloff. And yeah, I just have actually a lot of questions there, but I'll let you get some water if you'd like before we get into that.
Fine.
The Luciferians, do you see a difference between them and Satanists, or are those interchangeable terms?
Well, I've been, in touch. I've been on some podcasts with some people like Freeman Fly, and I better not give this guy's name. His podcast doesn't go by his name. But anyway, he's some guys who are really experts in Kabbalah and the occult, I'm sorry, give me that question again because I started to get distracted.
Yeah, so just differences. Do you see ideological differences between Luciferianism and Satanism, or
as I understand it, I'm not a real student of Satanism, but as I understand, the Luciferians are sort of, I guess, what you'd call the light side of the force, and the Satanists are the dark side, where the Satanists would be engaging in child ritual sacrifice. The Luciferians would give them a lighter version of that would look more positive to people. That's my basic understanding of that. But again, I'm not an expert in the history of Satanism, for sure.
Okay, so you kind of see it as like reduced sugar Satanism or diet Satanism.
Yeah, but they're definitely related. Yeah, and definitely both you should stay away from, for sure.
Okay, and then Ronald Bernard, he was the one that was related to Bohemian Grove, you said, correct?
No, he was not. Bohemian Grove is an American thing where the elite gather in California once a year. This has been going on since the 19th century, and they engage in this really weird stuff. Like they get up in these gothic costumes and something called the cremation of care. Alex Jones actually sneaked in there and took a film of the cremation of care, and they're engaging in a mock human sacrifice. And these are people like, we're talking about people like Dick Cheney and executives from Bechtel and Bill Clinton that have been there, but there's really weird occult stuff, and it happened right here in America. And that gives you a clue to just the dark side of America. But Ronald Bernard was in Europe, a currency manipulator, very high up. And he in his interview says there's 8,000 people that run the world. He says they're definitely Satanists because he was invited to take part in child ritual sacrifice. But he said he had a very rough childhood himself. And look, you watch his face during this interview. You watch the emotion on his face. He had to get out of there, and he's doing what he can to expose it. But actually, if you go back to 1955. William Guy Carr wrote what I consider one of the best books ever on the New World Order. It's called Pawns in the Game. And he was in Canadian intelligence. He identified this as Luciferian right there. And if you go up to the 1980s, I don't know if you've heard of Ted Gunderson. Ted Gunderson was in the FBI. He was the head of the special agent in charge of the FBI office in Los Angeles with 700 FBI personnel beneath him. And he, in his own investigations, found these people are Luciferians or Satanists, and he specifically said that William Guy Carr got it right. So this has been a continuum. You go from Carr in the 50s to Gunderson in the 80s to Ronald Bernard now. You see a real continuum. Another guy confirmed this was guy I haven't heard about lately, but his name was Dr. John Coleman from MI6, the British the British CIA. And he confirmed also these people are Satanists. So you got a lot of confirmation of this. And it's really this whole geopolitical battle we've seen going on with the New World Order really is a battle of good versus evil, really is a battle of Satanists against people who are followers of God. No question about it.
You actually answered my one question that I wasn't particularly going to ask you, but I wanted to ask somebody, and that was like, how many people are actually in this cabal? So according to Bernard, there's 8,000, which is definitely like less than 1% of 1% of the world,
right.
which is a very small proportion of the world.
Well, they're definitely they're formed like in a pyramid, and that would really correspond to the pyramid on the back of the dollar bill, which is a Masonic sign. And as you go up the pyramid, the groups get smaller and smaller and smaller. And I've heard that there's a council of 33 when you get up there, and then a council of, I think, of 9. And but as you go down the pyramid, at the wide base of the pyramid, you would have your low-level Freemasons and people who really, everything is compartmentalized, people who really don't know what's going on.
That was my next question. Was the Freemasons people? So they compartmentalize it like the military does. So people don't know what's happening. Really.
Yeah, well, actually, there was a group called formed by Adam Weishaupt with the backing of the Rothschilds in the 18th century, and there was a book exposing it, published in Germany, that pointed out that what happened was within this occult structure, you would know who your immediate superior was, but you wouldn't know his superior was. And so they'd always protect the next level above. And so you would never know who the people at the top really were. But this is definitely a real thing. And actually, if you want to go back in time, there's a book published in 1798 called Proofs of the Conspiracy by John Robeson, who was a professor at Edinburgh University. And he went to Europe. He exposed this whole thing. It was called Proofs of a Conspiracy. And he talked about the Freemasons and the Illuminati right there. So if people think the Illuminati are just an invention of modern day conspiracy theorists, you got to go back and disprove him writing his book and publishing it in 1798.
Do you have any further explanation of the Freemasons other than their lower level in this pyramid?
Well, at the end of Freemasonry, and I'm not an expert on it. I do have a short chapter in my book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior. I was just on a podcast with a guy named Michael Witkoff. He's also a convert to Orthodoxy. He's a former Master Mason, that's a high-ranking Freemason. And he's written a book exposing Freemasonry. Again, his name is Witkoff, Witcoff. We had a good interview. YouTube took it down in 2 days. Oh, wow. So it's now on BitChute. It's on BitChute now. But Freemasonry, when the Supreme Court banned school prayer and reading the Bible in 62 and 63, which is really that's part of the beginning of the 60s and the transformation of America. 5 out of 9 Supreme Court justices were Freemasons, including the Supreme Court justice himself, the head of the Supreme Court. And for sure, these guys considered their oath of loyalty to Freemasonry far greater than their oath to the Constitution. That's why they were willing to subvert the Constitution to advance a particular agenda. But yeah, the Freemasons take an oath of absolute obedience and absolute secrecy. They're not to reveal any secrets, and they are not to ever disobey. And in exchange for this, of course, they get privileges. They get, you know, if they're bidding for a contract in business, they'll get that contract. They'll get promotions within an organization from a fellow Freemason, things like that. There are carrots along with the sticks, you know. So the Freemasons, I don't really consider themselves the center of this New World Order, but they're definitely a useful tool. If you look at the French Revolution that overthrew King Louis XVI in France, even the Freemasons themselves boast that it was begun in their 2,000 Freemasonic lodges in secrecy, and that when the French Revolution occurred, what they call the French Assembly, their legislative assembly, was dominated by the Freemasons. The Freemasons themselves talk about that, you know. So they were really behind the European revolutions and behind our own revolution here in the United States.
Okay. Oh, we lost you there for a second. Can you repeat that?
I was just saying that I can't remember. I don't know where you lost me, but
you saying the Freemasons were responsible for most of the revolutions in Europe,
right? And also here in the United States.
Okay. Yeah. And how do, in those groups, I mean, I know you're not an expert necessarily, but do you know how they move up the pyramid? And also, is there, at the very top, is there literally just one person, or is it a council?
Well, no doubt they have councils, no question about that, and it'll get more narrow as you move up the pyramid. And again, in the back of the dollar bill, you'll see that they've got this unfinished pyramid. It's almost finished. It's got an eye hovering above it, and it's actually Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was a very high-ranking Freemason, who ordered that symbol, which is an ancient symbol, but he ordered it to be put on the back of the dollar bill. It had not been prior to that. As far as how they move up to the top, I would have little doubt that is related to how much they demonstrate that they are willing to conform to the standards and the goals of Freemasonry. If they are all-out American patriots, nationalists against globalism, they're not going to move up the ranks. But if they're willing to comply with this agenda, and they're useful and powerful and skilled, and that they're men that can be used to advance this agenda. As far as who's at the top, as far as I'm concerned, that even though people will not believe in, if they're materialists, they don't believe in Satan, I believe that Satan is at the top of this entire New World Order. He would be the eye at the top of that pyramid, and that we're moving forward to something that's been prophesied in the Bible, in the book of Revelation, a time when someone called the beast or the Antichrist would rule the world. That's what this, you know, one observation I made in Truth of the Lonely Warrior is that this whole thing of world government, Council on Foreign Relations, UN, League of Nations, global governance, which are talking coming out of COVID-19, that is, if you look at the book of Revelation, it says that the Antichrist will rule the whole world. He'll govern the whole world. Well, to govern the world, you have to have a world government. So it's not like when the Antichrist comes, he's going to snap his fingers and then there's my world government. No, we're actually building that for him right now. That's what's happened. We're coming up to a very unpleasant time unless we are able to stop it.
And you believe they want to rule from the holiest city in the world, which is Jerusalem in Israel.
Right. And that explains a lot of what's been going on with Trump moving our embassy to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv, and recognizing Jerusalem as solely the capital of Israel. The Scofield Reference Bible, Zionism, all of this has not been about something serving God's purposes, even though a lot of Christian Zionists, Christians here in America believe that. This is actually a satanic plan. And every government has a capital, and the capital of world government is to be Jerusalem. So we see that communism, which is about complete government control, globalism, which is to eliminate national sovereignty, and Zionism, which is to establish the center of this. Because, the Bible says in 2 Thessalonians that the beast is going to rule from the temple pretending to be God. And that's exactly what we're setting ourselves up for. And it's amazing when you look at things like House Resolution 6666, which is before the House of Representatives now, which is set up these contact traces for COVID-19. They're actually flagrant about using these occult symbols, even in our government.
And how, this is maybe a big question here, how does the Israelis play into all this, and Jewish people in general? Because there is that link between Judaism and Christianity, the religious link, I'm saying.
Right. Well, there's no question that Israel was a Hebrew nation, and most of the apostles were Hebrews. Paul, the famous apostle, was a great Hebrew scholar, no question about that. Over the years, what happened, though, was, of course, Jesus was rejected by the Jews or the Sanhedrin, the leaders in Jerusalem, and he was crucified. Over the years, the apostles continued to spread the gospel. They continued to spread the Christian church, but quite remaining adversity to them was what remained of the Jewish population after the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD, which is something that Jesus had specifically prophesied. They then developed something Jesus had condemned, the oral law. That became the written law, or the Talmud, which attacks Christianity. It actually says that Jesus is in hell and boiling in feces, and that his mother Mary was a whore. So there's been actually been an adversarial relationship between many people in Judaism, but again, many Christians look at it as an ally. And I have to say, there are many. I'm half Jewish myself. My father was Jewish, but he was totally non-practicing. There are many good Jewish people out there who are on the side of truth. There's people in Israel who want peace with the Palestinians, but I have to say, amongst the hardcore, the Likud, which is the right-wing party of Israel, and the hardcore Talmudists, the Chabadniks, who follow Rabbi Schneerson, who consider that Goyim or non-Jews are merely cattle. These people are definitely on the side of Satan and are working for this new world order. Maybe not all of them within a compartmentalized world are realizing that, but definitely that's how they would fit in. But again, never would I intend a blanket condemnation of people who are Jewish or who live in Israel.
Okay. Thanks for that clarification, Mr. Perloff. And you said you're half Jewish because of your father, and you actually did not know that until your 20s, right? He hid it from the family?
Yeah, that's right. I didn't know I was Jewish, and the only way, or half Jewish, the only way I found out was in 1972 when I was 21. My roommate had a new girlfriend, and we went to see a movie which was A Candidate with Robert Redford. And me being a liberal, I thought that movie was just great, And after the movie, his girlfriend said to me, "So Jim, you're Jewish, right?" And I said, "No, I'm not Jewish." He said, "No, nothing to be ashamed of. You're Jewish. Go ahead, admit it." I said, I'm not Jewish. And I wasn't being defensive. I just had no idea. And I didn't even know anything about Jews except that Hitler was persecuted in the World War II, and that they had something to do with the crucifixion of Christ. And so after this long argument, this girl was so positive that I was Jewish that I called my mother and I said, "Mom, are we Jewish?" Because I'm just a dumbass kid. And my mother said, "Well, no." Which she said, "Well, your father's Jewish, but he didn't like to talk about it." And that's really true. He never mentioned it once. He wanted no identification with Judaism. And so I was never in a synagogue, and he had made no identification with it. All his friends were Gentile, and he had wanted nothing to do with it. He actually grew up in a Jewish orphanage because his mother died when he was 4 years old of tuberculosis, and he had 3 brothers and 2 sisters, and his father decided that it was too much for him to handle. So, and this is down in Atlanta, Georgia, his father put the 4 boys in an orphanage where my father grew up, and the girls stayed at home. My father was never very happy about that. But I should mention, there also was this guy named Frank in Georgia who murdered and raped a 13-year-old employee. and due to some, he was sentenced to death for this crime by a jury. But apparently some very influential Jews up in New York City influenced the governor of Georgia to pardon, well, not to pardon him, but to commute his sentence, his death sentence. The people in Georgia were outraged by this, and they took this guy, Frank, and actually hung him near the place where he murdered and raped this young girl. And I'm looking back on this, I feel that in Georgia, where my father grew up, there was definitely resentment against Jews at that time, and it's not something you wore on your sleeve. So when he left the orphanage and he went to University of Florida, where he got a chemical engineering degree, it was being Jewish wasn't something you wore on your sleeve, and he just decided he was better off not identifying as Jewish. So I did not learn that till I was 21. To me, it's not meaningful, but I also feel that it maybe gives me a little bit of an edge in criticizing Israel, which I do believe that Israel's policies toward the Palestinians are abominable. And if anybody wants to accuse me of being anti-Semitic, I do point out I am half Jewish, on my father's side, and I definitely am not. But I'm not interested in that. I'm only interested in justice and people's character, and their ethnicity is not what counts.
Yeah, definitely. Well said, and definitely a lot to go over there. When I go rewatch this and re-listen to it, I'm gonna re-annotate everything. It's quite the story about your father there. Somewhat related. Why not evangelical Christian? Yeah, you said you didn't. You were like kind of pushed away from being evangelical.
Yeah, well, one thing that really turned me off this isn't true of all evangelical churches, but one church I attended was very pro-war, and they were constantly saying that our wars in the Middle East would defend our liberties, and I knew that was not true. All you have to do is really go back and read Smedley Butler's. He wrote a book called War is a Racket, and this is a long time. He was the most highly decorated Marine in U.S. history, at least at the time of his death in 1940. He was no wimp, but he said that all the wars he'd partaken in were for the bankers. There were banker wars. He knew that in the 1930s that was true, and he didn't even wear some of his medals because he knew what they really stood for. But this church I was going to was very pro-war, very pro-Israel, and again, false theology that was coming out of the Schofield Reference Bible. I really found that as someone who was been writing on history for 3 decades, and I knew these things were false, I could not sit there in the pew and be told things that I knew were not true. I mean, I reached the point I had to get out of there. And but this is when I found the Orthodox Church about a year after that, and I started looking. I said, there's got to be a place I can worship and still feel right at home. And that, for me, that was the Orthodox Church.
And I remember my question that I was going to ask before this, which is politically incorrect, but I'm just going to ask it because I want to, I don't want to self-censor and let them win. Why are Jewish people so talented?
Oh, I guess that's probably genetic. That's a great question. But there's something else about that. Now there was an article by a guy. I want to say his name was Joel Klein in the LA Times of 2008, and he was Jewish, and he said Jews do run Hollywood and the media, and he actually proved that by showing who all the CEOs were of these movie companies and media companies. And he was Jewish himself, and he said he was proud of that fact that they dominated the media. But I want to point out that I don't think it's just talent. If you look at all the studios going back in time, Warner Brothers and MGM and Paramount and Columbia, almost all of them were Jewish run. Disney was not, but its since has been taken over by people who are Jewish. And so it's not just a matter of talent that they run these media companies. It's a matter of who's got the money. And you look at the central bankers, you look at the Rothschilds, and money, humanly speaking, money makes the world go around. And so they've put themselves in these positions of power. And so is it that they're really talented, or is it that they get these positions of influence within media through financial power? That's another question to ask. But I wouldn't doubt that Jews, by and large, if you look back at the comedians when I was a kid, almost all the comedians, Woody Allen was Jewish, but Milton Berle, and these are people you wouldn't remember, but Sid Caesar, and you probably know Rodney Dangerfield, and Mel Brooks, and all the comedians. Jewish people do seem to have a talent for humor. That's I wouldn't die. I think that's something that just goes with. If you look at most races and have, I think that they're diversified. It's reasonable to say it's not racist to say that many races have or ethnicities have certain things that they're really good at, and I think that's okay to acknowledge that.
Yeah, definitely, and just acknowledging too that it's both genetics and culture.
Yes, right.
Yeah, thanks for that answer there, Brother Nathaniel. Okay. Oh yeah. You said so in most churches in America, you said they're like a spin-off of a spin-off of a spin-off.
I think
it's kind of funny and a little accurate. But you said you wanted to go back to like the foundations, I guess, of Christianity and traditions. What were those, and maybe explain a little bit more why? Because you mentioned Constantinople as far as that pertains. Because I grew up Lutheran, for example. Which is, Martin Luther, of course.
Right.
So I don't fully understand all the other denominations as well, and the differences between them. So. Yeah.
Sorry. What's the express question again?
Oh yeah. So just what were those traditions like? Were the Orthodox traditions that you were going for, that you saw, or was it just the text that you were?
Well, the worship service is almost identical to what it was in the 4th century. St. John Chrysostom and some others who were the original leaders of the church after it was legalized. We use the same liturgy. Now, Protestant denominations are not liturgical. It centers around usually most churches center around the sermon, and so these churches tend to get characterized by whoever is the pastor of the church. But the advantage of liturgy is somewhat repetitive. They isn't exactly the same every week. They have different hymns and different verses that they will quote, but basically the ceremony is the same. And the centerpiece is the communion, the Eucharist. That was always the centerpiece. If you go back in time to the 1st century, we have a document of the 1st century, the Didache, which says that the service was centered around the communion. And yet in most Protestant churches today, I believe I'm correct in saying that communion is something that they occasionally give, but they've changed it. It was no longer bread and wine, it's crackers and grape juice, and it's not consecrated the way the apostles taught. But the advantage of liturgy and the continuation of it is that it does not give you the opportunity to alter it. Unfortunately, many churches today, their pastor, the elder board, will worship whatever way they want. And so it keeps changing and changing until it's no longer recognizable from its original form. I wanted to go back to the original form of worship that existed in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries. And that's what you get in Orthodoxy. Although I have to say that I am concerned that many of my brothers and sisters in the Orthodox Church, although many of them are quite faithful in their observance of the faith, are not awake to what's going on in the world around them geopolitically, which I write on.
Thank you for that answer, Mr. Perloff. And you wrote a book called The Case Against Darwin. When did you first encounter Darwin's ideas, and how long before you started to question them?
Okay, so when I became a Christian in the early 80s, I was still troubled by the fact that I had been taught that scientifically we came from apes. So as a Christian, this is long before I became Orthodox, I was really interested in the fact that when I grew up, we had a subscription to National Geographic. They would show these pictures of a guy named Louis Leakey. He was in Africa, and he was looking at these skeletons of Australopithecines, and he said, this is our ancestor from millions of years ago. I said, I really want to know, is that true? Or is the biblical account true? Because the biblical account of Adam and Eve is totally different from this evolutionary story, which they say we're scientific. And I want to, observe science. I want to know what the truth is. So I started looking at that in the mid 90s, and I read a book called What is Creation Science by Dr. Gary Parker and Dr. Henry Morris. And it blew my mind because they knocked Darwin's theory apart. And I started reading more and more books about that. And I said, wow, I mean, the reason I was an atheist for a long time, and then I became a New Ager. But what started me on the road to atheism was in the 6th grade when my teacher taught us Darwinism. And I had a little classmate who raised her hand and said, well, Mr. Horowitz, that's not what the Bible teaches. And he said, well, the Bible is wrong about that. And all my classmates chimed in and they said, yeah, the Bible's wrong. It's a bunch of malarkey. And so I said to myself, even though I wasn't raised on the Bible, I said, oh, so that stuff that the Bible says about Adam and Eve is all junk, huh? That started me on the road of becoming an atheist, and actually was a cause of some trouble in my life. It wasn't until later that I discovered that God was, to me, a reality. And then I got really interested in the creation evolution debate because I realized that actually Darwin's theory was a house of cards. It was pretty easy to knock over. In fact, I did an interview with SGT Report. You might have heard of them. And actually, the interview I did on Darwinism, it's called God is Real, is actually the most watched interview they've ever had. It's had close to 3 million views. And that comes out of, that interview actually came out of PowerPoints I gave for a number of years on the subject of creation versus evolution. So that was a subject that fascinated me because I really wanted to get to the bottom of the truth. Were we evolved over millions of years, like Darwin said, or were we created? And I found the evidence pointed towards creation, and you couldn't, pure chance is not going to create the human race. No way. So even when you got some natural selection going along with it, it's not going to happen. Mutations, which change the genetic code of a fish, are going to usually harm that fish. They're not going to build it up into some more intelligent creature. Sorry, ain't happening. So I've written my main book on that is called Tornado in a Junkyard. And the reason I wrote the little book called The Case Against Darwin was because somebody said, I want to get a lot of copies of your book to give to school board members and public officials. And I said, that book is over 300 pages long. They're not going to read it. So I said, I got to come up with a short book. And that's how I came up with the short book, The Case Against Darwin. And that was all right before 9/11 was happening. And 9/11 really changed the landscape of what I wrote.
Okay. So for you, well, just a segue. What is Creation Science by Gary Parker and Henry Morris, right?
Yeah, that's a book that just explains the fundamentals of why we're created and designed. There's an ancient argument called design proves a designer. So if you go to the beach and you see some rocks that seem to form the letter E, that could have come there by chance, right? But if you see the entire words of the Declaration of Independence written out in rocks, that didn't come about there by chance. If it's too well designed, it had to have someone design it, and that's one of the fundamental principles there. I've lost track of what your original question was there. You were asking me about creation. What is creation science? Yeah. Well, the book was about why Darwin's theory was wrong, and what I found was that a lot of the books were out there. There's some great ones by Michael Behe, other great writers talking about the basic aspects of Darwin's theory, why it's wrong. But I found a lot of these books were written by scientists who were not specifically journalists by trade, and made great arguments, but the books were kind of hard for a layman to read. So I wrote Tornado in a Junkyard because I wanted to write something that was really reader-friendly, something to be easy to read and that people could relate to. And I took their arguments. I didn't change them. I referenced those. I've got almost 700 footnotes in the Tornado in a Junkyard, but I wanted to make it so it's very readable and very understandable to the average Joe, because that's what you want to reach. You want to reach people with you want to make reading fun and easy.
Is there a compromise in your eyes between science and religion in terms of how we evolved, or do you think it's entirely creation?
Well, I think we're created, but God made our bodies with smart cells so that we can adapt. So that animals, if the climate got colder, they could grow longer fur. Or if you are sick, your body will start to generate a lot of white cells. Your body adapts. It does adapt. There is such a thing as adaptation. You adapt to your environment, and God made us so that we could do that, so we could survive. You definitely can adapt. But what Darwin did is he said that a fish could adapt all the way to be a human being. That's where we differ. There are adaptations and changes in species over time to let them better survive, but those do not cross you over into being another type of animal, which is what Darwin was proposing, is you could go from being a bacterium. By the way, in the entire history of bacteriology, not one cell, not one bacterium has evolved into another species of bacterium. In the history of bacteriology, which goes back over 150 years, never happened, ever. So the idea to go from a bacterium to an invertebrate to a fish to an amphibian to a reptile to a mammal to a man, that's what Darwin said. You could adapt all the way from a bacterium to a man. That's his mistake, is thinking you could jump from one type of animal to another. There is adaptation within a species, but not this adaptation from one kind of animal into a totally different kind of animal. That's where the difference is. So yeah, there's this I wouldn't call it a compromise, but actually at its root, belief in God and science are quite compatible.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Perloff. And this will segue nicely, I think, into our current situation. You got vaccines when you were a youth that caused low spectrum autism undiagnosed. Can you explain that and when exactly that was? Were you a pretty small child when you got those?
Yeah. This is something that I can't recall because it happened when I was an infant, less than 1 year old. But my mother told me that when I was an infant that I couldn't sleep at night, that I had fevers, that my skin was totally inflamed. And she said it was almost like my skin was falling off. And so she took me to the doctor, and the doctor said, well, I don't know what it is, Mrs. Perloff, but it must be, your breast milk is too rich. And so why don't you put it on the bottle, which is the worst thing he could have said, because, our mother's breast milk it contains all kinds of pro-immune factors, which you need. But what I found looking at my own medical records was what was causing it was the DPT shots, which I got at 2, 4, and 6 months old. Because when I got an immune booster, when I got a DPT booster at the age of 7, I immediately had a fever and a rash. So it didn't take a genius to figure out that what was happening when I was an infant. But that actually impacted me neurologically. So I was quite withdrawn as a youth. And I couldn't have had a conversation like you and I are having now. I was very withdrawn. What they would call dorky, but it was neurologically impaired. It wasn't until quite later on when I actually went through a detox program that I actually had this welt on the side of my neck. It was big, and it was purple. And I asked my mother, Mom, where did I get that from? She said, oh, that's when you got vaccinated, And looking at back now I know that that was my own immune system walling off the poisons from the vaccine. But I went through a detox program that involved sauna and exercise and lots of vitamins and stuff like that. And then the welt went away, and it was actually changed me personally after getting through that. But there are a lot of people out there today. You start to do some study, you'll find that the anti-vaxxers. You watch the movie Vaxxed by Del Bigtree. That's a great movie where they talk to children who became totally autistic after taking vaccinations. The vaccine schedule is much rougher today. Now, when I was a kid, it was just, a handful of vaccines, but now they're getting, I think it's 72 doses by the time they enter school. And you've got 1 in about 30 being autistic, whereas it used to be 1 in 10,000. So definitely we're being poisoned. And I did experience that on my own level. I was what you call I could function certainly when I was young. I could talk to people, but I was very withdrawn. I thought I was an introvert, I'm an introvert, when I first saw that word introvert, I said, oh, that's me. Because I had a very hard time carrying on good conversations with people, and I couldn't play sports well at all. And it was, teased a lot. And now I can play sports fine, it's just a matter, I didn't understand it. Neither did my classmates at the time that I'd been negatively impacted by vaccines, but to be sure. And I could also see when I started to see the vaccine schedules as a registered nurse, and starting in 1990, when they were starting to talk about how we all had to be vaccinated against hepatitis B, when there actually was a very low risk of getting it. I started to, that was like a red flag for me. And I said, I'm going to investigate this later. And later on, over the last 7, 8 years, I started to look into vaccines, and I started to see just how harmful they were. And I realized that there was a whole population control agenda in the New World Order, that this was part of it. And I started to realize that things like Alzheimer's and Lou Gehrig's disease and all of what we classify as autoimmune diseases are basically coming from vaccination. So I'm very, very anti-vaccination. I don't mind saying that openly as a registered nurse. Dr. Rashid Buttar, who's had some great videos on on COVID-19. He says that it's certainly possible to make a vaccine that might be beneficial. You might be able to train your immune system to better respond to a specific, foreign invader. He says he thinks that's possible, but he says that when you look at the vaccines, what's in the vaccines, the number of toxins, the formaldehyde, the mercury that's still in every flu shot, that's right in the CDC. They admit it's in there. The thimerosal was in there. My mother had severe Alzheimer's starting at the age of 89, where she couldn't remember what she said at the start of a sentence. She'd try to finish her sentence. She couldn't remember what she said a few seconds ago. If you're in the room with her, she couldn't remember you'd been in the room with her. Now, my father, on the other hand, who died at the age 1 month short of the age of 100, my father was so sharp, the age of 99, he could still remember Charles Lindbergh flying overhead in the year 1927. Remember, sharp as a tack, but he never got a flu shot. My mother got a flu shot every year, and it gets to the point where the mercury in that shot, your nerves can't handle it. It starts to degrade, to really have a serious impact on you. Without the mercury and the aluminum and those flu shots, old people would not be getting this Alzheimer's. That's what I've concluded. And it's not just me saying that. I'm actually quoting people like Dr. Sherry Tenpenny, and I have a blog post called Vaccination Visuals, which a lot of the videos in there have been taken down by YouTube. So a lot of it's defunct at this point, but no question that many doctors have come out now and openly stated that vaccination is quite harmful. I've been talking too long on the subject, but let me just finish by saying I recommend that people watch and download and watch the movie Vaxxed by Del Begtree. It's an excellent movie with many interviews with doctors and with parents of victims of vaccination.
Thank you for that. You were not, droning at all. We have this question from Venus, and that's actually my next question. Is there a safe vaccine or one for maybe certain diseases that you should get?
I would doubt it. I don't think haven't studied every vaccine, but the fact of the matter is, when we were kids, we didn't get an MMR shot. We got the measles and the mumps naturally, and we used to, it was a natural thing. I mean, kids got the measles, you'd be out of school briefly, and you got through it, and most all kids got through it. It was a natural thing. And trying to substitute that by injecting you with an MMR shot when you're still an infant, when you normally wouldn't get the measles, you're giving these people several pathogens at once, and you're bypassing the immune system and injecting it directly into their tissues rather than let it come through the through the nose or the mouth, where you would have immune defenses naturally operating. I don't think that there's a vaccine out there. And they're giving the hepatitis B shot the day a child is born. Why would you need a hepatitis B shot? You can only get it from a dirty needle or from having sex with a prostitute. It makes no sense, but it makes billions of dollars for big pharma when they make a vaccine mandatory. Every mandatory vaccine, which has been given to millions and billions of people across the planet, is hugely profitable to them. And as you know, they're immune from prosecution if they cause any harm due to the Vaccine Injury Act of 1986. So, yeah, big pharma and vaccinations, I consider them to be a major part of the New World Order agenda. And you can actually go back more than 100 years and find evidence that they were talking about using it to distress the peoples.
The Vaccine Injury Act of 1986. I actually did not know that.
Yeah, no vaccine company, manufacturer can be sued, even if they cause myriad people to be injured and paralyzed by it. They're completely immune from prosecution. And what that means is they have no real incentive to make sure that vaccines are safe. Because if you get injured by a vaccine, you can go to what they call vaccine injury court. And if you win your case, which is not that easy to do, you'll be paid, but you'll be paid by the U.S. taxpayers. None of the money will come out of the pockets of big pharma. So this is a very corrupt industry we're dealing with. Not to say that there aren't some good medications out there sometimes that can be helpful. I'm not denouncing the industry as a whole, but certainly when we're talking about vaccines, the injury has been severe and widespread throughout the world.
Wow. I did not, I don't even know. Well, as far as the money goes on this vaccine agenda, it seems like there's the money aspect and the depopulation aspect. So those are two objectives. Are there any other objectives that they're trying to obtain with this?
I think those are probably the two major. Well, actually, somebody made a good point. Dr. Sherry Tenpenny made a good point the other day, which is that when you make somebody vaccine injured, you create a customer for life because, you know, you're going to have them on medications for the rest of their life. And so you create a big pharma customer when you injure somebody at birth or in their early child years with the vaccine.
And where are you broadcasting out of, Mr. Perloff, if you're okay with maybe just giving us the general location?
In the greater Boston area.
Oh, okay,
How about yourself?
I'm in the Pacific Northwest right now. I'm in the state of Oregon.
Okay.
Yep, but I'm actually moving to Nevada pretty soon here. So,
oh, really?
Yeah. So I actually just got here, and then this whole situation popped off, which we should definitely get into. But yeah, I left Italy like 2 days before the virus got there. But let's talk about this pandemic because we just talked about vaccines and the agenda there in terms of autism and mercury. And you mentioned your mother had Alzheimer's. Your father never took flu shots. My parents, fortunately, never got us to do flu shots. We just did the required ones, I think. And speaking on that, you know what I noticed is I had this scar on my deltoid for like most of my youth from shots, and it recently went away. It went away within like the last year. So it's really interesting because I thought I was always going to have that. Just it's related to what we're talking about with vaccines. But yeah, this pandemic. What are your thoughts, Mr. Perloff?
I guess the first thing I should mention is that, well, I was working on a book on 9/11, major book, and I disrupted it due to the COVID-19 crisis, and I felt that I should write a blog post about that. And on my website, jamesperloff.com, it's Perloff, I do have a major blog post on COVID-19. I keep updating it as new information comes in, which is just about every day. And so he's considering maybe I should turn this into a book because I know it's challenging to read a long blog post, but I wanted it to be a reference people could go to, because right now it is really difficult to get information on YouTube or the major search engines. They're censoring everything that is disagreeing with the official story. Even many PhD scientists, Newt Kwiatkowski, the epidemiologist, Dr. Judy Mikovits, I'm sure you've heard of, Dolores Cahill is an eminent PhD immunologist. She's been censored on YouTube. These doctors out in California, Masihi and Erickson, they're all getting censored. But Bill Gates, who has no medical qualifications, he can say anything he wants, no problem. So because it's so hard to find information, you go into Google to do a search, and everything will come up. It'll be Snopes, PolitiFact, which is funded by the Gates Foundation, and mainstream media. You won't find any alt media sites coming up at all, at least for me, when I do a search on Google or other major search engines. And so I really wanted to put something up there that people could still find the information on. Again, it's a long post. I just advise people if it's too long, just take a break and treat it like a book and come back and finish it another day. But I wanted to really address 4 major areas, and those areas are the impact of the lockdown, which is undebatable, the human impact, the civil liberties impact, and then I wanted to go into the panic, the inflation of the death numbers, and then the third part is on the different theories about what COVID-19 really is, and because there are a few of them out there. And then I finally want to get into the deep state's agenda. They're looking for the global vaccine, and they're looking for the global ID, and they're looking for the cashless society. Basically those three parts to it. And I try to close off with some positive information about all the people who are doing things against this agenda. But again, that's on jamesperloff.com, and the blog post is called COVID-19 Red Pilled. I probably didn't really answer your question, but
no, I will link it, Mr. Perloff, in the description box, but maybe you could just give us a Spark Notes.
We'll definitely do that. So, excuse me.
We
As
got
a registered
join
nurse,
join
sure, yeah, as a registered nurse, I knew that this was not in conformity with standard infection control practices. You do not quarantine healthy people. We quarantine people is because they, they were sick and they posed a danger. They had a highly infectious disease, but never have we seen healthy people being quarantined and being told they had to be staying at home. Never. So I knew right away that this was not in accord with standard practice, and it was obvious from the get-go that this is part of the New World Order agenda. But if you look at the lockdown, the last figure I saw was officially 38.6 million people newly out of work since the lockdown began here in America. And you know what that's going to do to people. I mean, you lose your job, you lose your hope. Suicide rates are soaring. There's a 600% increase in calls to suicide lines. Child abuse, domestic abuse. Of course, if you lose your job, then you can't pay your rent or your mortgage. You're going to lose your home, even though I know that they're going to be telling landlords and banks to be patient with people who are out of work due to COVID. But eventually, if you can't, they say that something like 43% of small businesses will not reopen. If you lose your job permanently, eventually you're going to get kicked out into the street. And you're also going to lose your health insurance if you haven't got a job. So if you're homeless and you haven't got health insurance, is that going to be healthier for America? I'm sure you've seen the videos of the woman in Brooklyn who was thrown on the floor of a subway station in front of her daughter because she didn't have her mask on right. And I maybe you didn't see that.
No, I haven't seen that one. I have seen some though, Mr. Perloff. But go ahead if you. I'll add some stuff after.
Oh, well, it's just insane. The guy was arrested for playing t-ball with his daughter in a park. He was handcuffed in front of his 6-year-old daughter, and just insanity. A county in Indiana that made it illegal to buy books because they might have COVID-19 germs on them. And Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan, saying that you can't even visit a friend or your own mother unless you're a caregiver. And she's being sued right now by doctors, by medical centers in Michigan, because what's happened is that people are not getting other medical care. They're not getting screened for cancer. They're not getting treated for heart conditions. They can't get eye care or dental care or all the other care that they need. Everything's being given a back seat to COVID-19. Yeah, and people are going to be dying from this. Alcoholism rates is the rate of selling alcohol at least is up 600%. I don't think it's actually measured the rate of addiction, but the destruction of our whole economy. And Uncle Sam's not in a position to pay people for this. Uncle Sam is in debt for $23 trillion officially. So that the government, they're writing these checks, stimulus checks, which won't even pay you half a month's rent in Boston, near where I live. Of the $1,200, the nation is being destroyed, and it's insanity. It's utter insanity. And you look at the Bill of Rights; every plank is basically being demolished. I mean, you can't peaceably assemble. You cannot gather for worship. They now are getting a little bit more lenient with churches, saying that you can gather to 40% capacity, but you still have to one way and wear masks and no handshaking, and even the choir has to wear a mask. And it's kind of like, it's not exactly the same experience, right? And actually I was told by one person at his job that they not only have one-way routing through his office, but they actually have stop signs like on the road. It's insane. The regimentation of culture, like in Swampscott, Massachusetts, a nurse was going along the road and these guys were painting one-way arrows on the sidewalks, and it's like insane. I mean, if this is an airborne virus, well, the wind is going to blow it anyway. So why are you putting one way? It's just like a total control situation. Everybody has to stand 6 feet apart. And I don't know if you saw the images from France at the playgrounds where the children all have to play by themselves. And this is so destructive and so damaging to the human spirit and the human condition.
Saw, it's pictures of them of kids. They have to be by themselves.
Yeah, you can't play with other kids. And actually, there are no deaths of children from this thing, and they don't. There's no evidence. There's no actual evidence that children pass this disease on, even if they might have the germ. So there is no scientific substantiation for this. But we're really seeing the New World Order kick in. I think this may be true. A lot of people have hypothesized is that because alt media was doing such a good job of exposing the New World Order that instead of boiling the frog, as they say, and incrementally bringing about the New World Order, they felt they had to put the foot on the accelerator, censor everybody, and really go all out to bring about this global vaccine and global ID and global surveillance and get the whole New World Order in place. So I really honestly feel we've got a huge battle on our hands. I've only talked about the lockdown so far, but we talk about the inflation of the numbers, the theories, and the end game. But we will have a battle on our hands. It looks like they're really going for broke to try to impose an all-out system of global governance upon people, seeing how obedient they'll be to this. And it's unfortunate. I have friends who are, they're in the system, they're in the matrix, and I'm kind of like taking the gloves off at this point and saying, I can't be gentle any longer. I have to tell them the truth, whether they think it's ridiculous or not.
Yeah, well, just on responding immediately to what you said there, do you think people, I mean, for example, just me, Mr. Perloff, I haven't really talked to like my family about this in any sort of forceful way. Is that a mistake?
Well, no, I think it's very, very individual, and it depends on where people are at, and it depends on your relationship with them. And would this be something that would really damage your relationship with them if you came on too strong with it? And where does that weigh against the in the ultimate consequences? So I think it's very individual.
Okay, gotcha. And then just responding to because you said a lot there. I've had actually some personal experiences. Well, in my entire life with police officers and authorities, of course, but just with COVID, since that's what we're talking about, I was walking in a residential area, live streaming actually on YouTube with my cell phone, and this cop followed me like alongside of me about 10 o'clock to the left for almost 2 minutes as I walked, just alongside it. And I don't know if they were waiting for me to make a mistake or what, or run away, or I don't know. I mean, I would be lying if I said I wasn't nervous. But just a weird thing that happened to me. And then they kind of deflected their attention to somebody across the street who may have been homeless, because I don't know, maybe I looked like a not easy target or something. I don't know. I eventually just stared at them until they because I was like, what is this person doing? Just going further into COVID, well, before we do that, can people, as far as rent goes, say 80% of Americans can't pay their rent? Can they, what happens then? Like, can they just take everybody's house? The banks just take everybody's houses, or what happens?
Yeah, that's probably going to be on a state-by-state basis. I know that they're telling landlords to go easy on tenants, but I think that the idea is that the tenants should eventually make it up. If I was a landlord, I certainly wouldn't be kicking people out right now, because your new tenants are going to have the same problem, right? I mean, you're not going to do any better with your new tenants. So I don't think it makes a lot of sense to kick people out, but it's going to pose a challenging situation. It depends on the landlord, but or the bank, I guess. But if people aren't able to make their mortgage payments, the usual thing you do is foreclose the mortgage, kick them out. Now, the banks are going to have to look at this from the perspective, again, of can we find somebody else to replace this person who's going to, but it seems like they're really trying to just wreck our economies in order to force a new economic system on us, probably with a global currency and, everybody being chipped and everybody becoming dependent on the government. I think they've got a real long range plan in mind here, but, it will be an individual situation between landlords and tenants. I know I have somebody I spoke to the other day who said that their business is considered non-essential, but they're having to supposed to pay rent. So they said they're going to talk to the landlord. I'm sure the landlord will work out something with them. And I think if you're a decent landlord, you're going to work out some kind of compromise and say, well, it was of no fault of your own that you couldn't pay. But what if you can't pay because you permanently lose your business or you permanently lose your job? Then the landlord's probably going to start looking for another tenant, and that's when you're going to be in trouble.
Yeah, definitely. And this state, I think, perhaps would have the biggest impact, along with the landlord, like you said, Mr. Perloff. Governor Kate Brown here in Oregon initially gave a 90-day moratorium on rent. I don't know if that's been extended or not, but yeah, going just deeper into the coronavirus pandemic, do you want to talk about another branch of this situation we find ourselves in?
Yeah, well, for one thing, the one thing that makes this all ridiculous is that we've had worse pandemics. The Asian flu of 1957 killed about 1 million people worldwide, and then around 100,000 here in America. That's according to the CDC. That's worse than COVID. Well, there was no lockdown, and nobody even suggested a lockdown. Same thing with the Hong Kong flu of 1968. 116,000 dead in America, attributed to it by the CDC, and about 1 million worldwide. So why did we lock down then? Why just now? We've had very similar pandemics in the past. So you got to put it into some perspective. In fact, the flu season of 2000 to 2018, according to the CDC, 61,000 people died. Again, no panic headlines in the media, no CNN saying 1,000 new flu cases in Kansas, All right, so the other thing is the way they're inflating the numbers, which is just absurd. Early on, Dr. Vernon Coleman, who's an MD in the United Kingdom, made a pretty good video, and he's pointing out that the death rate in the UK was being inflated because they were testing dying patients for COVID-19, but people on the outside of the hospitals who weren't symptomatic or just had mild symptoms weren't getting tested for COVID-19. So this gave an undue proportion to people who were dying. And this increased the death rate from COVID-19. That's the first way they've done it. And, by the way, the whole model we use for COVID-19 comes out of the UK, speaking of the UK, from Neil Ferguson in the Imperial College model, which has now been debunked by a number of analysts. But that's what Dr. Fauci used to convince Trump to lock down America. Well, Neil Ferguson, who came up with this model, they called him Professor Lockdown. He was not observing his own lockdown rules. In fact, he was carrying on an affair with a married woman. So he was not observing social distancing. He was not locking down. It's a scandal. Okay, but we're still in lockdown because of this guy. And actually, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying I saw that in England, right?
Yeah. And National Review did a review of this guy, and they said this guy's been constantly over-predicting pandemic results. For example, in 2003, he predicted that the bird flu would wipe out 150 million people. Well, actually, over the next six years, it wiped out, I think it was 282 people. So he's got this long track record of being wrong, but we used him anyway. Okay, but another way they inflate the death numbers, besides undue proportion of people who die, is that they are conflating other diseases with COVID-19. So in Italy, they really scared Americans when they said, the death rate in Italy from COVID-19 is 10%. But the Italian government has now clarified, and they've made this official, that 99% of those who died with a COVID-19 diagnosis actually had what they call premorbidities. They had advanced lung disease, advanced heart disease, cancer, and actually there's only 1%, 1% of those were actually dying from COVID alone. So the death rate was nowhere near 10%. It was more like 0.1%, which is what you expect from the seasonal flu. And also here in America, actually, let me get the references on this one. They've been pumping up the death numbers in the same way. Even Dr. Birx, who's now the response coordinator for COVID-19, worked with Dr. Fauci, has admitted that anybody who dies from COVID-19, actually from another illness, but they happen to have COVID-19, is counted as a COVID-19 death. You see how they inflate the numbers that way. And I also, in my article, also linked to a video of the public health director of Illinois, where she says anybody who dies from any cause, if they have COVID-19, is counted as COVID-19. So you see, if they're dying from cancer or other causes, it's counted as COVID-19. And that really scares the public when they see those death numbers in the headlines. They don't understand what's going on behind the scenes. Even Dr. Fauci himself wrote an article for the New England Journal of Medicine. He quoted it with two other doctors. This is March 26th of this year, called Navigating the Uncharted. Here's what Dr. Fauci said, quote, if one assumes that the number of asymptomatic or minimally symptomatic cases is several times as high as the number of reported cases, the case fatality rate may be considerably lower than 1%. This suggests that the overall clinical consequences of COVID-19 may ultimately be more akin to those of a severe seasonal influenza. That's from Dr. Fauci himself. Okay, but then you start to look at what other people are saying besides Neil Ferguson. Stanford University has done a study now. Medical researchers from Stanford did a study that said the actual death rate is 0.12% to 0.2%, just above seasonal flu. And then you've got Drs. Erickson and Masihi, who in their county in California did a study of COVID deaths, and they found the true death rate is 0.03%, which is well below seasonal flu. Now, those guys have been censored on YouTube. And actually, this is funny. The local station in Bakersfield, California, WABC 23, did a story on these guys. And even though they're mainstream media, their video was censored by YouTube off of WABC's website because it disagreed with the Bill Gates and what Fauci and the CDC are saying. But it's amazing how they're taking qualified doctors with scientific facts, not conspiracy theorists. These are just doctors, PhDs, who are telling a different story, and they're not allowing another side of the story to be told to the public. But the other way they're doing it is with death certificates. And there was a great interview that I've embedded on my web post. It was Laura Ingraham on Fox News. She did it with Dr. Scott Jensen. And it was she pointed out that the CDC, she quotes the CDC now, they have new guidelines, quote, in cases where a definite diagnosis of COVID cannot be made, but is suspected or likely, it is acceptable to report COVID-19 on a death certificate as probable or presumed. Now, Dr. Jensen, Addy, he really went ballistic on this, because he said always death certificates are supposed to be written with what he calls specificity, precision and specificity, because legal issues can arise as to depending on how a person died. But now we've got the National Vital Statistics System, which is a branch of the CDC, says, quote, COVID-19 should be reported in the death certificate for all decedents where the disease is assumed to have caused or contributed to the death. Now that you're just assuming that COVID-19 was involved. And Project Veritas, I imagine you've heard of them. Project Veritas has a video, which I also linked to, where they interviewed.
Could you explain Project Veritas for those that don't know, Perloff?
I'm sorry?
Could you explain Project Veritas for people who may not?
They've been going in for a long time. I think they did this to the Democratic National Convention last election. They are investigators who will they're very hands-on, and they go to sites and they find out that news stations are faking news coverage, or they will actually go into I think the one time they went into Planned Parenthood and they filmed people talking about how they're selling baby parts. They do a lot of hands-on investigation. But in this case, the one I'm specifically referring to in relation to COVID-19, they spoke to a number of funeral home directors in New York City. And they said that they were getting COVID patients classed as COVID-19 who were not COVID-19. They just wrote it on the death certificate. And one of them speculated that Mayor de Blasio was doing this so he could get more federal funding. You get more federal funding, apparently, if you have COVID-19 cases. But they were saying that these were definitely not COVID-19 patients, but that they were just being written on the death certificate. And this is happening overseas as well. In fact, let me see if I can find this. This is like a personal example, but this is from a British newspaper, presumed COVID-19. And this is the son of a woman who died. She says, "Sir," letter to the editor, right? Local newspaper in North Hampshire in England. "My mother died last week in a care home at the age of 98. When my brother registered her death as expected, the cause given was frailty due to old age, but he was surprised to see that the doctor certifying the death had added presumed COVID-19, an inclusion that also shocked the home's manager. The day before our mother died, my brother was allowed to sit with her for an hour. His temperature was checked before he was admitted, but there was no form of isolation. None of the home staff were wearing personal protective equipment. If doctors are attributing all deaths in care home to COVID-19, it makes nonsense of any statistics and does great reputational damage to both the individual care homes and to the care industry as a whole." And signed by the gentleman's name, Christchurch in Dorset, England. So this is happening in England, not just New York City. It's all over the world. Well, I shouldn't say all over the world, but in a lot of countries, they're inflating the numbers by falsified death certificates, attributing cancer deaths to COVID-19, other causes to COVID-19, and giving undue weight to people who have died as opposed to people who just have no symptoms at all. I live near Boston, as I mentioned, and in Boston we have a homeless shelter called Pine Street Inn. Well, they tested the patients there, the homeless people. 146 tested positive for COVID-19, but guess what? None of them even had any symptoms. So most people, when they talk about, there's all these new cases of COVID-19, these are people, many of them have no symptoms or just mild. Even WebMD says most people who get COVID-19 have mild to moderate symptoms. But I do want to add one caveat to this. There is one thing that's distinct and deadly about COVID-19. Some people get a very severe lung reaction. It's an autoimmune response, which they call cytokine storm. I'm sorry for talking for so long, but I felt we should add this disclaimer. Some people do die from it. They get an autoimmune response in their lungs. I believe this is what they called in Wuhan, China, what they called it glass lung. Your lungs go into an autoimmune response when the virus invades, and there's not many people, but a few people get it, and they wind up with hardened lungs. They can't breathe well. They wind up on respirators, and some of these people, even some people in the 20s and 30s, die from it. But based on the evidence we're seeing, which they're trying to suppress now, people who take hydrochloroquine with zinc, you reverse it right away, that cytokine storm. So, but I did want to put that disclaimer in there. The numbers are grossly inflated, but it's not to say that that it does not exist or that it is not in some cases deadly. But the deadliness does not in any way justify this horrific lockdown, which is destroying our national life and our international life as well.
Yeah, no worries about talking too long, Mr. Perloff. That is why we are here, and that's why we're doing this format, this long form, which I think people really enjoy, as opposed to those short bits. But yeah, they do see occasionally like permanent lung damage or organ damage. But again, it is in a minority of cases, and that's the thing too, is we don't know for sure any of the information that we're receiving is true 100%. So that affects everything we absorb as well.
Yeah, it's very hard to assess what the true death rate of America is. It's not what the media says. Even the media disagrees with the CDC. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, CDC said 37,000 Americans, and CNN said 65,000. So, it depends on who you're listening to. Yeah. But the death, I will say this much: the death rate is definitely higher than what they're saying, both the CDC and the mainstream media.
Yeah, and I just wanted to talk about people, since before I mention that too, I just wanted to comment on the ludicrousness of some of the censorship that you mentioned, like doctors recommending vitamin C and turmeric and anti-inflammatories, which are, they apply literally all the time.
They've always been known to work.
There's no debate. And the fact that you got, I don't even know how to say her last name, but the woman at the top of this platform, her saying that people saying you take vitamin C will be, shut down. It's just like, I don't know, like, it's weird. Like, and I'll talk to people I know about this that I'm really close to, and and it seems like they just hallucinate. Like, they just like almost like bewitch themselves, and they're like, oh, whatever. It's like, what do you mean, whatever? That is fucking weird as shit that they're saying shit like that. And, like, I don't know, like, it makes me a little, like, paranoid, because it's like you're not sure if the reality you are seeing is the same reality that everybody else is, which, I guess is more of a philosophical debate than anything else. But we don't have to get into that right now. But speaking on zinc too, I went to Target like 3 weeks ago and it was completely gone.
Okay. That means some awake people probably weren't buying it, or unless they took it off the shelf deliberately.
Yeah, and let's talk about some figures here, some people. You mentioned the little man, Dr. Fauci. What are your thoughts on Mr. Fauci?
Well, I haven't read it yet, but you may know that Dr. Judy Mikovits, who worked with Fauci, has written a book called Plague of Corruption. It's the #1 bestseller on Amazon right now. It's actually out of print, but she's made that book freely available to. She picked up. I'm on Twitter. She came on Twitter, I think, a month ago, and I looked a couple of weeks ago. She already had 120,000 followers. I mean, this woman is popular. But she's not the only one. Another one that I've gained great respect for is Dr. Dolores Cahill, and her credentials. You got to roll out a long scroll I mean, this woman is a PhD immunologist, but her interview on YouTube was one of them, at least, that was censored, and now it's on BitChute. But she is speaking very eloquently, saying you don't need a mask. That it's not. She says Ebola was airborne, but this is not. And I've actually written to her. I wrote her yesterday. I hope she'll maybe have time to answer me back. I'd like to know what the studies are, because a lot of times when I know that masks are harmful. You rebreathe your own carbon dioxide, and you're not getting enough oxygen if you wear them. In fact, there was a guy in New Jersey. This is the mainstream news. His car crashed, and the police he crashed into a pole, and police attributed it to the fact he was wearing an N95 mask for so long that he went unconscious from rebreathing his own carbon dioxide. People should not be wearing masks all day, and I feel sorry for these workers who are having to do it all day long and not take off, barely ever have a chance to take off their mask. But I'm looking for some studies that definitely confirm this is not airborne, because that's the argument I usually get from people. Well, it's airborne. The CDC says so. The CDC says it changes its mind a lot. Though the CDC originally said any surface you could get this from, and now they've changed that guideline. They say it's very unlikely that you could get it from touching a surface. So apparently people did not need to wipe down those surfaces all that time that the CDC said. So a lot of conflicting information. But yes, and definitely some great people on YouTube. And one person I really like to follow is Dr. Rashid Buttar. That's Buttar. YouTube has censored many of his videos, but last time I looked, they had not censored his channel yet. But he is another one that's out there. Another person that I really like is Yvette. I can't remember her name. Lozano, I believe it's Lozano, Yvette. And she was interviewed by Laura Ingraham for Fox. And she did a video that was censored by YouTube, where she was talking to a crowd of people in Texas. And she was talking about the amazing, almost 100% success she's had treating people with hydroxychloroquine and zinc. Now, the reason they're suppressing this, Addy, is that if people realize that the death rate is really low, I mean, according to the Stanford University study, at least 99.8% of people recover through their own immune system. And the remainder that don't, the 0.2% that don't recover from COVID-19, they can be treated successfully with hydroxychloroquine and zinc. So you see, there's no need for this vaccine that they're screaming about. The White House has this Operation Warp Speed to get a vaccine before the year is over. We don't need that vaccine. Most people are not going to die from this virus. And those that do get this cytokine storm we talked about, this hyper autoimmune reaction, can be the symptoms quickly resolve with hydroxychloroquine and zinc. So there's no need for a vaccine. That's why they're suppressing it. They want to go ahead with this population control, Bill Gates vaccine.
I've got a question here from a listener, Mr. Perloff. Masks are dangerous. Why do doctors wear them?
Well, they've been instructed to, but also you have to remember that even though it's not good to not breathe oxygen it's not good to rebreathe carbon dioxide. If they're dealing with COVID patients, the disease is contagious. I was on a podcast recently, and the podcast, a person to a family where all 4 people died. It did spread as a contagion through the family. So if you're on a COVID ward, or if you're in an ICU where there are COVID patients, there is a risk that you will get, and if you turn out to be one of those unlucky ones who does get this hyper autoimmune reaction, you wouldn't want to be one of them. So I don't blame doctors for wearing a mask when in contact with people who have this disease. These patients who are quite sick are infectious at this point. But what I object to is, of course, people who are perfectly healthy, have no signs of the disease, and they're being quarantined or essentially quarantined at home.
And those 2 PhDs were Dolores Cahill and Yvette.
Cahill. Oh, look her up. She's great. Look at her credentials at University College Dublin. It's amazing. It goes on forever. I would love to see her in a debate with Bill Gates. I really would.
Yeah, I'll see if I can get in touch with her. Definitely.
Yeah, she's done interviews. One of them, like I said, was suppressed, but she's done more than one interview. And she said that she will personally debate if they want to put on every doctor in Ireland. She's from Ireland. If you want to put on every doctor from Ireland who believes that this thing should cause a lockdown, she will take them all on personally, like a kid who plays all the chess masters at once. She will take them all on. And I believe she can do it. If you listen to her, she has an amazing intellect.
Donald Trump what are your thoughts on our president, Mr. Perloff? Because I have changed my, my thoughts and views on him. It seems like it's almost constantly changing. But I mean, I've mentioned this before, so some of my viewers have heard it. But I didn't really pay attention to politics until 2016, which was culmination of university for me. And it got to the point that I couldn't ignore it anymore. And in fact, I actually actively ignored it. Like I put effort into, just keeping it out of my attention.
Mm-hmm.
But I voted for her. I regret it. And if I could redo it, I would vote for him or not vote at all, depending on the day, maybe. I'm not really sure. That may change. But yeah, what are your thoughts on Donald Trump?
I voted for him, and I think what happened was this. People had wised up to the fact that presidential elections are basically a sham in America. They have been for a long time. In fact, if you go to the 1937 book, America's 60 Families by Ferdinand Lundberg, which I think it's a great book, but I won't recommend it to people because
your memory of the books is encyclopedic, Mr. Perloff. I love it.
Well, but he talks about how people like Woodrow Wilson, Herbert Hoover were pre-selected by the rich, and that is. And you go back to 2008, 2012, The Onion, which is a satirical website, they had great satires on how the elections were rigged. And in the year 2012, I have a friend who was a delegate for Ron Paul at the 2012 GOP convention. And Ron Paul was absolutely cheated out of he'd won through the primaries a floor nomination. But at the convention, they changed the rules to increase the number of states or primaries victories necessary to get a floor nomination. And they even canceled his speech by having a fake weather report predict a hurricane for Tampa on the night that he was supposed to give his speech. Well, it turns out that the Weather Channel is co-owned by Bain Capital, which Mitt Romney formerly headed. Okay, so I mean, the whole thing was a rigged job, and people left that and they said, I'm done with politics, I'm done with elections, I'm done with voting. But what happened was Donald Trump came along, and all of a sudden this guy was talking about the mainstream media, and he had great sound bites. I did vote for the guy because I felt that it was a no-brainer for me not to vote for Hillary because she was 100% her pro-Rothschild agenda. Everything from gun control to internet censorship, everything she stood for was wrong. So I said, let's at least vote for Trump. At least we'll take a chance on him. What I found about Donald Trump, I don't want to take the time to go through the list, but he's basically been an Israeli firster. I could go down a long list of things that he's done that have shown that he puts Israel's interests ahead of America's. And by the way, Pastor Chuck Baldwin, who's a former presidential candidate himself and commands a great deal of respect in Christian circles in America, has also written many posts about this himself. But right now, in terms of the COVID crisis, I really feel we're getting mixed signals from Donald Trump, maybe because of an election year, but he's done some good things. Like he cut the funding to the World Health Organization, which up until he cut that funding, Bill Gates was the number 2 funder. Now Bill Gates is the number 1 funder of the WHO. He's also, he himself, as I'm sure you probably saw the headline, said he's been taking hydroxychloroquine and zinc, which Big Pharma is totally against. These are good things. On the other hand, he's established Operation Warp Speed to get a vaccine out by the end of the year, which is what Bill Gates wants. And he also says he's going to deploy the U.S. military to deliver it. And when about 3 months ago they said they were signed a treaty with the Taliban to end the war in Afghanistan, I knew right away that was to bring the troops back home for this internal. Even before Trump announced he was using the military, I knew that it was going to be used for this COVID crisis at home. And so very mixed signals from Donald Trump. He certainly won some support from people against the lockdown. He's been encouraging the churches to open up and encouraging the economy to open up. I don't know what their end game is. To tell you the truth, there have been some signs that this could fall apart for them. There was, I got to get the lady's name. Let's see if I can find it.
By them.
Wait a minute. I just saw an interview. Probably haven't seen it, but it's an interview like about 3 days ago. The lady's name is Sunetra Gupta. She's a professor of theoretical epidemiology. These are the people who study epidemics at Oxford University. And Gupta, that's Gupta. In her interview, she said that the signs in Britain are this pandemic is petering out. She said the numbers are going down. I know that in Japan, the numbers are starting to really drop. And this typically happens in a pandemic. The virus will run its course. And if the virus runs its course here in America and the ICUs run out of COVID patients, it's going to be very hard for mainstream media to keep up the panic until the COVID vaccine is ready. Now, I don't know what else they're going to do. There's a talk about them turning on 5G really hard and making people sick and disguising that as COVID, or maybe they're going to release an even worse bioweapon, some kind of a engineered bioweapon that'll make people sick and force the vaccine on people. You may or may not have seen, there was an interview with Ellen Dershowitz, the attorney, recently. This is like within the past 5 days, where he said that you have no constitutional right to refuse a vaccine. And if the government wants to, it can take you, even though you're perfectly healthy, it can take you, in his own words, were plunge a needle into you, So this is dangerous turf we're headed into. But I'm wondering if the vaccine actually runs its course quicker than the perpetrators of this whole dilemma thought it would. Will they be able to sustain the panic through the summer into the fall when they think they're going to have this vaccine ready, which I suspect is ready already? They're just having to go through the motions of looking like they're running through trials before they use it against the population. This is what I suspect, but that's speculation. I can't prove that is the case, of course.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that if you think, because it would make sense for them to have it ready already. But then I was thinking, well, based on the reactions of the governments, it does seem like this was a surprise to everyone.
Well, actually, I think it was not a surprise in as much as you probably have you heard of Event 201?
Yes. That was in October of 2019, right? The U.S. war game or something?
It was, well, it was a scenario where they dealt with a outbreak of a coronavirus pandemic. And this is according to their own website, if you go there. But it's partially funded by the Gates Foundation, October 2019, the same month that it started in Wuhan. They went through this entire drill, which included shutting down alt media websites and pressuring the media giants to do that. And it absolutely mimicked. And plus, in January, there was a 3-part miniseries run by Netflix called Pandemic, where they talk about there's this pandemic and they have to get a vaccine out. And actually, this is the first year in history, I believe, that Easter has been globally canceled since Easter since Christianity was legalized by Constantine in the 4th century. Well, there's a British hard rock band called The Darkness, and in October of 2019, they released an album called Easter is Canceled. Now, if you follow the entertainment industry, they're always coming out with this predictive programming. They did it in many ways for 9/11. Last September, I had 100 tweets out, and many of them concerned predictive programming of 9/11 that appeared before 9/11. Like the March of 2001, you had this. I'm going to forget the name now.
The Simpsons, right?
I'm sorry.
Family Guy or something.
This was a series, and their pilot episode was about the hijacking of a plane, electronic hijacking of a plane to fly into the World Trade Center. And this is March of 2001. I mean, there's so much predictive programming on 9/11. Oh, it's called The Lone Gunman. I'm sorry. My mind is kind of out of that 9/11 right now. It's into COVID.
Oh, that's okay.
But actually, I tweeted this out the other day. Somebody sent it to me. There was an interview. I think the guy's name is David Vox, an Israeli podcast. You showed him how, if you go to the World Economic Forum, which was part of Event 201, they had on their website, they've got a COVID response webpage, and it's got hundreds of underlined pages, and it's like, how did they put this together as a response to COVID-19? Obviously, it was put together in advance, and plus, all these international protests were taking place against 5G. Hong Kong, the Yellow Vest, have all been shut down because of COVID-19. It looks like this thing was definitely planned in advance. They knew what was going to happen. I don't have absolute proof of that, but the circumstantial evidence added up weighs heavily in favor of the fact that this was a planned, orchestrated event. And that probably means whatever is going to happen in the fall or is going to happen next has also already been planned. But I think it's really vital at this point, probably more so than ever, that we wake people up. There are a lot of people, you know, just standing out in line outside of a store. I heard fellow citizens who are not probably red pilled really raging against the government over this lockdown. And I think this is a good time for people to get woken up.
Thank you for that, Mr. Perloff. I agree. And just speaking on Dershowitz, or Dirty Dersh, as somebody called him in the comments here, was that Jason Goodman's interview?
Yeah,
I was watching that live, and I was like in the live chat a bit, but yeah, I was listening to him, and I was just like, oh my goodness, what is this guy doing?
Yeah, because he's a constitutional scholar, supposedly, and he's probably one of the voices they're going to call upon if they make this vaccine mandatory and say no matter how healthy you are, you have to be vaccinated. Remember, these vaccines they're developing are entirely experimental. Moderna and there's another company that the U.S. just gave $1.2 billion to.
Is that emergent?
It's called AstraZeneca. $1.2 billion. Now they're making messenger RNA and DNA vaccines, which have never been used on the public before. They want them at Operation Warp Speed. And I saw a TED Talk the other day by Tal Zaks. He's an Israeli, and is the chief medical officer for Moderna, which Bill Gates has pledged $100 million to, and which has gotten almost $500 million in U.S. taxpayers to develop vaccines, even though they have no success in terms of getting marketable products. They're losing money all the time, but they're making these. What he said in his TED Talk is what we're doing is, quote, actually hacking the software of life. And what they're talking about with these RNA, DNA vaccines is they're going to change your DNA so that you can properly respond to COVID-19. As if God wasn't smart enough when he made your DNA. We're smarter at Moderna. We're going to change your DNA. This is really frightening. And this is experimental, made at warp speed without adequate long-term safety testing being done. This is really frightening. And it looks like what they want to do is, what they like about a vaccine is compared to a virus can get out of hand. It might infect some of the 1%. They don't want that, right? But with a vaccine, you can choose who gets it and who doesn't get it. They can be very controlled in the way they deliver it. And actually, it's pretty obvious, especially when you look at the other things they're doing with the digital ID, the digital tattoo. We can get into that. And the cashless society, you can see where we're really being. It's not just vaccines at warp speed. It's a new world order at warp speed.
It reminds me of Jurassic Park, Jeff Goldblum's character, when he's like, we didn't stop to think whether or not we should.
Yeah. Well, that's what I'm afraid a lot of Americans are going to do if they take this
vaccine. And hopefully it's not too late, because Dershowitz, and you mentioned a lot there, Mr. Perloff. I love it too. Dershowitz was palling around with Epstein.
Yeah, he was. Epstein was a client, and Harvey Weinstein was a client too. Because he's had a lot of clients over the years. Those are two of the more despicable.
Live with us wherever you guys are around the world, in the United States or the United Kingdom. Good evening to all my Americans tuning in. And in the UK, it's the middle of the night, so you're either up really early or you're up really late, depending on you. And yeah, being a shout out to Ryan Dawson and Sean Atwood for fighting the good fight, and for just having quality content. And big ups to Sean Atwood, because he's definitely a man of the people, and supports small guys on YouTube like myself. But Mr. Perloff is joining us again, and we are just going to talk a little bit more about Epstein and Dershowitz, if that's okay, Mr. Perloff. I just want to know what you know more about Epstein and your understanding of that network, and then if we could do a pivot a little bit about the U.S. educational system, and then we can wrap up with what can we do to prevent this this COVID takeover, or what can we do as far as the pandemic goes?
Well, I can't tell you about Dershowitz's relationship with Epstein. I don't know anything more than having read a couple of sentences about that. So that's not something that I could go into. I know, of course, that Epstein is, I mean, his death has become probably the #1 meme of this year, at least before COVID came along, and that he was Mossad connected, and that many people believe that he was probably eliminated because he could have revealed so many details about pedophilia and other abuses by the elite. And of course, Bill Gates, since we're talking about COVID-19, Bill Gates was good friends with Jeffrey Epstein, met with him, according to the New York Times, met with him several times after Epstein was already convicted of sex crimes. So, you know, he's definitely linked to the power elite. He was, his black book included Mike Bloomberg, you know, who was a presidential candidate for a while there. Yeah, definitely relevant, but no, I don't have any kind of expertise in Epstein other than what I've same social media things that I've been reading as you and our listeners have been.
That's all right, Mr. Perloff. I had to ask because it's something that everyone is interested in, including myself.
Sure.
It reminded me of another question I actually had about Trump and Israel. So you said that Trump has a record that you can see of putting Israel first.
Right. That's for sure.
Why is that? And what, could you give examples of that? Because I actually think we just gave him a bunch more aid, didn't we?
Yeah, just recently. Well, okay. This has not been on my mind lately, so I'm just going to look at some
no worries
here. Yeah. Donald Trump, well, I know this even before he ran for president, he was the only American celebrity to do a campaign commercial on Israeli television for Benjamin Netanyahu. And some people think that this is sort of an IOU he had because, you know, Trump, a number of his businesses went bankrupt. He was bailed out by people, including his current Commerce Secretary, who's at Wilbur, I want to say Ross. Again, this has not been on my mind just lately, but okay, so during his campaign, if you look at his campaign, he always said that our allies should pay their own defense costs. Well, obviously, he excluded Israel from that. Israel continues to get billions of dollars every year. His daughter, Ivanka, married Jared Kushner, who a big-time Zionist. His family, well, he's a member of Chabad Lubavitch, which is really a Jewish supremacist organization, and his family, the Kushner family, bought 666 Fifth Avenue, which is the headquarters for the makers of the RFID chip, which is, you know, certainly a lot you could read into that. He hired as a special assistant Adam Avraham Berkowitz, who was first cousin to Howard Friedman, the former president of AIPAC, which is the Israeli lobbying group here in America. Trump, on his inauguration day, for the first time ever, the inauguration was immediately followed not by a Christian pastor, but by a rabbi. In this case was Marvin Heyer of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, who quoted Psalm 137 saying, "By the rivers of Babylon, we wept as we remembered the Zion. If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill." Well, right there, that quotation kind of tips you what Trump is going to be doing with Jerusalem, making it declaring this capital of Israel. On inauguration day, he said he was going to build a missile shield against Iran. So the whole Iran thing was already beginning from day one. The month after his inauguration, he invited Netanyahu to the White House. He's now dropped cruise missiles twice on Syria over fake allegations of chemical weapons use. By the way, I have Christian friends from Syria. That is all bull. Assad protects Muslims and Christians alike. He's beloved by the people of Syria. One of my Syrian friends pointed out, no, not 100% of the people in Syria support him. Do you know any American leaders who had 100% support of the American people? No. Also, he did this arms deal with Saudi Arabia worth up to $350 billion. He continued the neocon wars in the Middle East, Afghanistan, until he just recently, because of the COVID thing, stopped that. But he continued the drone strikes, supporting Saudi Arabia while it destroys the people of Yemen. he did something really beyond his authority. He declared that the Golan Heights, which have always been Syrian territory, now belong to Israel. Now, what business does the President of the United States have ceding the land of another sovereign country to another country? But he did that for Israel. And he also, again, recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. We've had the first ever U.S. military base under Trump built in Israel, joint military exercises with Israel. Pompeo, November of last year, announced that the U.S. recognized all Israeli settlements in the West Bank as legal, which had never been done before. In December, Trump gave an executive order equating anti-Zionism to anti-Semitism. Then he carried out this assassination of General Soleimani, the Iranian leader, who was actually not on a military mission, he was on a peace mission at the time. And this is a mission the Israelis had failed out. So apparently they asked the U.S. military to step in. So also he's announced that he's going to recognize the West Bank as belonging entirely to Israel, which have always had, that's always been part of the Palestinian land. Many Palestinians would consider the entire land what they call Israel to be Palestinian. So there's a long list of pro-Israel moves that went way beyond the pale of what any previous president had done. So I got to say, this guy is Israel first, more than he is America first. Although right now our national attention has shifted from the Middle East, where it had been focused for so long, to this internal crisis with COVID.
Yeah, and to the east more so with China. And you answered my question again, Mr. Perloff. I was going to ask what you thought about that settlement on the West Bank. How would you define neocon?
Well, the neocons, you go back to pre 9/11, and this is, again, I was working on a book before it got disrupted by this COVID crisis. The neocons included people like Cheney, Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz. There were a whole group of people who were part of PNAC, Project for New American Century, who were calling for a new Pearl Harbor. It wasn't just in their Project for New American Century document that they put out. It was written all over the map. I mean, Paul Wolfowitz in 2001 gave a speech to the graduating class at I forget it was West Point or Annapolis. I think it was West Point, where he told them they needed to be ready for a new Pearl Harbor. And the movie Pearl Harbor came out in May of 2001. I mean, the signals were all over the place. There were so many examples of where the neocons were what they basically were. Not all of them were Jewish, but most of them were. And this included I'm sorry, the names are going to escape me, but it included the people who had come on board as conservative because they were talking about building up America's defenses. And American patriots always like to hear that. They say, oh, you want a stronger America, you must be patriotic. Well, they were not talking about building up America's defenses to defend us. They're talking about building up America's military in order to wage war against all these countries in the Middle East on behalf of Israel, which many of them have much greater loyalty to than to America. I would certainly say that was true of Paul Wolfowitz, who was Assistant Secretary of Defense under Bush. There's no question that his lawyer, in my mind, Douglas Feith was another. He received an award, I think it's the Louis Brandeis Award from the Zionist Organization of America. He was very high up in the Defense Department. Richard Pearl, who they call the Prince of Darkness, he was in the Bush Defense Department. He was actually caught spying by the NSA from spying for Israel on America. He was not prosecuted for it. And there's so many guys who have.
That's execution.
Go ahead. I'm sorry, I'm talking too long. Go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was just, can you hear me okay, James?
I can hear you just fine. Yeah.
Okay. Wait, isn't that high treason and thus execution?
It should be. Spying in America for a foreign country should be considered treason, but he was not prosecuted. But people at the NSA actually came forward. This, I think, goes back to the 1980s. He was spying for Israel, and NSA members made it public because he was not being prosecuted, but he still wound up in the Bush Defense Department.
Okay. This author and media publisher, journalist I interviewed recently, Ryan Dawson, he may have changed his definition slightly, but what I gleaned from his websites, where he defines neocon as kind of the mix between you get like Zionist, evangelical, and then combine that with the wealth. So he's saying they have both the financial and ideological means to achieve their war ends.
Yeah, that's reasonable. I know that Ryan Dawson is a good man. He's done he's been censored quite a bit. I think he had a
That's
excellent video on I think he had a video on Vimeo, which was quite. I watched it. I paid to watch it, and now they've taken it down. Even though people who were supposed to be able to still watch it who paid to watch it. He's a young man, but he's very on top of things and very on top of what's been happening. What happened with 9/11 and what's been happening in the Middle East. These terrible wars that have cost us trillions of dollars and have cost millions of people their lives in the Middle East and caused tens of millions to be displaced from their homes.
Before we get to any concluding thoughts, Mr. Perloff, what do you think about our educational system in the U.S.?
I think everybody should be homeschooling. And ironically, that's one of the things that COVID-19 has sort of encouraged people to do. But it's an agenda system. When I was a kid, we used to read books. Now I understand they don't even read books in school anymore. They just read excerpts. And as smartphones and laptops take the place of books, I think we're moving into a 1984-ish world where it's basically about indoctrination. It's about advancing the social agenda, making one of the worst things we call COVID a new normal. The new normal before this was the old transgender thing. Now, I know a red-pilled doctor. She's totally red-pilled. And she talked about how at Children's Hospital in Boston, they were cutting the breasts off young women and ripping their ovaries out because these teenagers thought they wanted to be boys instead of girls. And this is just insanity. It's been established as a new normal for our culture, and it's satanic. Honestly, it's satanic. And that's what they push and they're pushing heavy duty sexual material on kids in kindergarten. And you can see that this is not, drag queen story hour. These things are not educationally oriented. These are things that are intended to change our the way people think and transform them into the type of human beings they are. And it's not the America I grew up in. It's very destructive. And I would encourage people, if they can, to keep their kids out of public schools. I've known, one time I gave a talk at a homeschooling convention on creation versus evolution, and the kids there were so well behaved. I told my wife it was like being in heaven. Every kid was well behaved. I mean, homeschooling, you can get plenty of socialization as a homeschooler. You can be at church. You can socialize with the homeschooled kids. It's great stuff. So I'm all in favor of that. And our as far as I'm concerned, the public school system is basically in the toilet. But that is not to deny that there are good teachers out there. And actually, my own son, he went to Christian schools for 10 years. The last 2 years, he's an athlete, and he wanted to go to public school for the better athletics that were offered there as opposed to Christian school, and he did that. He came out fine because he had a good, solid Christian foundation. He remains a Christian to this day. But yeah, definitely, I'm not keen on what's happened to our public schools. Really, truthfully, ever since the Supreme Court, I mentioned this very early in the broadcast, ever since the Supreme Court banned prayer and Bible reading from the public schools in 1962 to 63, that's when the big change came. And actually, after they made that decision, SAT scores went down for 18 consecutive years. They didn't come back up, nudged back up in 1981 until Ronald Reagan's first year in office. It's fact.
Well, that is something I did not know. And that correlation is not something that is readily obvious or intuitive. What about the universities? Well,
I feel like the universities become partnered with the banks. I mean, the student debt is ridiculous. In 1962, the tuition at Harvard per year was $1,520. Now, even adjusting for inflation, it was very cheap to go to college back then. But now, people spend like $250,000, $300,000 for 4 years of college. They come out with enormous debt. These kids who are graduating this year, they're not going to have jobs because the businesses are all shut down from COVID. It's like the universities have become to a large extent a business partnered with the banks, and they're part of the debt system now. It's sickening to see. But you can still get a good education. I mean, you could go to a good science program or engineering program, and you can still get a decent education. But if anything people can do to avoid the being in debt, I certainly advocate that. That the debt system has been a method of slavery for centuries.
I agree. If they are still places where you can learn and find good programs, but yeah, don't do it at the cost of getting in debt. I agree with that, Mr. Perloff. So do you have any final requests of the audience today? I love chatting with you, Mr. Perloff. I learned a lot. I'm going to finish your book. As I said, I started that. And yeah, I've learned a lot, and I definitely can tell that the people in the comments really enjoyed it as well. They love these long form conversations and interviews. But yeah, do you have any asks of the audience? Oh yeah, and then what can we do before that? What can we do as far as this pandemic?
Well, I think anything you can do to wake people up, like I say, I have a blog post, Red Pilled, COVID-19 Red Pilled, on my website, jamesperloff.com, and I do a lot of podcasts. But I also wrote a letter to my local newspaper, which was published a couple of weeks ago, urging that the lockdown be end, and then I gave my credentials as a registered nurse, and it was limited to 400 words. I also sent a message to my congressman, urging that he oppose H.R. 6666, which is the contact tracing bill, which allows $100 billion to be delegated to contact tracing and other purposes. When did you hear of $100 billion being given to quote unquote other purposes, which aren't even specified? So I thought that was a no-brainer. But, writing to your congressman, it's not that your congressman will really listen to you, but I think it's something you can do, or writing to your local newspaper, or calling up local talk radio, or just whatever you can do to inform people and wake them up, because I think that people are more ripe right now than ever before to hear the truth, because they're very upset about losing their jobs. They're very upset about losing their careers. They're very upset about what's happening to our country. And they really sense, even if they've been blue-pilled all their lives, they sense that something's not right about what's going on. So I think this is an ideal opportunity to really take this challenge and to address it with as many people as we can, and to wake as many people up. Again, my books, Truth of the Lonely Warrior. This is a designed to. I find you can't convince people to talk about one issue. So this book talks about media control and the Fed and the CFR and false flags and the Masons and weather control and vaccines. And I tried to get everything in there I could in a relatively brief, 300 pages, but I tried to make it very easy to read. And then my most recent book, 13 Pieces of the Jigsaw, explores some of these things in greater depth. Plus, it tackles things that I never even touched in Truth of the Lonely Warrior, such as electromagnetic frequencies and the dangers of Wi-Fi, things like that. So those two books together can help wake people up. I really want to get people out of the matrix. I love it when people wake up. I think it's pleasing to God, by the way, because we serve God as a God of truth, So I think that it's important that we do these things. I'm also on Twitter. I learn a lot from Twitter, from people who tweet out articles and videos that I never would have heard of otherwise. And I try to put stuff on Twitter that I think will be relevant for people to know about. So I'm on there. Again, my website is jamesperloff.com. It's P as in Peter, ERLOFF. And my most recent article is called COVID-19 Red Pill, which I keep updating.
Okay. Yeah, I love Twitter too, Mr. Perloff, and I just followed you, so looking forward to that. All of Mr. Perloff's links, including the link to his Amazon page as well, will be in the description box. Is there any other places people can buy besides Amazon?
Well, if they buy in bulk, they can contact me directly, but I prefer that people actually buy. As much as they don't like Amazon, it's a monopoly. It's designed to be a monopoly, but because I don't have time to individually send out each order, I do prefer that Amazon does the packing and shipping for me.
Yeah. And it helps with your algorithm too, right? So you can move up the charts.
I'm sorry?
Like it helps with your ranking on the charts, right? In the Amazon algorithm.
Yeah, I don't know if they monkey with that somewhat. Yeah, I never know if they're completely being forthright, but they even suppressed my book Truth of the Lonely Warrior on Kindle last year for some ludicrous reasons, and I was able to get get it back up there. But yeah, if people buy the book on Amazon, it helps its ranking. And like I say, Judy Mikovits right now is the #1 best-selling book on Amazon, and that's quite an achievement for somebody who's going against the grain of the New World Order.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Mr. Perloff, for chatting with me today. I'd love to do it
it's been
again.
a pleasure. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to do it again sometime.
Yeah,
but
well, great. I didn't think we'd run so long, but actually, I felt like we never really ran out of relevant things to discuss. So it was well worth the time for me. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Perloff. Yeah, you definitely have a lot more experience in this game of life than I do. So yeah, just trying to pick your brain from all that knowledge you have. I hope everyone enjoyed this. Again, this has been Mr. James Perloff, author, and